That should work. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. Apparently, like I said, forgetful and knuckleheadedness. So yes, hello everybody. Now you can hear me. I am here with LazerPig. The T-34 is not as good as you think it is. And if he's saying the T-34 is in the Russian tank, I am slightly worried because fanboys of the T-34... I've met a lot of them in World of Tanks. Anyway, so yeah, yeah. Oh boy, this is gonna suck, I think. So, apparently, he's, now, okay. Okay, so where do I start on the T-34? Okay, the T-34, it's difficult for me to talk about the T-34. On one account, it was the armored fist of Stalin that crushed the German lines. On the other hand, it was a communist tank, well, I promised I wouldn't get political, but god damn it, it's just too perfect. Look at Ukraine. All Russian tanks seem to be falling apart. You know what? Let's just see what the pig has dug up on the T-34. Let's see if it actually correlates with anything I've ever gotten. Then again, he's probably a better historian than I am. Now, before I get this started, because I know there's somebody out there who obviously is going to go after this, because there's a few comments, like, again, not naming names, but I'm still just going to put this out here. This is a comedy show. We're here to make jokes. We're here to have fun while also learning history. I'm here to learn shit, but I also know some of this shit. So, to all the people who don't like me acting silly or basically just don't like me talking so much and want me to take this seriously, you're in the wrong fucking place. Please, backspace, go to another channel. Believe me, it'll save you and me a lot of headaches. Okay? We good? Okay, let's go. Let's go piss off some T-34 fans. Oh boy, I'm gonna live to regret this, aren't I? Too bad I don't have my alcohol. I just have water. Alright, let's get this started. Let's see what you got, pig. LazerPig presents an award. We're not gonna get it, pig. We're YouTubers. Presented in drunk vision. Oh boy. Oh, really?
So anyway...
How dare you! Calling out such penis-enhancing weapons like the A-10 to be unworthy of their received praise is one thing I can accept. But the T-34? Sir, you have crossed a line. This was the armored fist of Stalin, which annihilated the Nazis with such a vigorous tenacity, it caused the so-called supreme race to question their own validity. This war-winning machine was the greatest tank of the war. No, sir, the universe. The so-called superior tanks of the Germans could only dream to have accomplished such feats of engineering. To ridicule such an icon, dare say, sir, I would question your very claims to be an accomplished historian. In fact, I may have to report you to the history police. You see if I do.
No. A few years ago, I had a brief yet energetic discussion with a young chap. Now, he was not an amateur historian by any stretch of the imagination, not a quoraposter or a Varibu. He'd written several books. He had his own history blog, a YouTube channel, was a consulting historian on r/Ask Historians, the most coveted of positions, and he clearly did a lot of research. But he took exception to me because I believe that the British Cromwell tank was a better tank overall than the Russian T-34. He disagreed in a series of rather lengthy responses. This was my first experience with the Commie Boo.
Commie Boos?
Commie Boos, yes, they exist.
And they're everywhere. The natural enemy of the Veriboo. In our attempts to rid ourselves of this Veriboo plague from our reality, we've allowed the common Commiboo to fester and breed until we get to the point where low-tier YouTubers cannot innocently browse Reddit looking for their femboy vorporn without being accosted by them and their feverish accusations. But you, me, we're different. We're historians. I mean, dramatically amateur and mostly drunk, but historians nonetheless.
He is absolutely right. Amateur historian. I'm not drunk today, though, because I gotta go do shit later today, but usually I'm drunk. Now, continue, Pig.
And I love you all. So tonight, come with me on an adventure, because I wish to enroll you into a secret club, known by few, but loathed by many. This club is for the elites of the historian world. For this, as an exclusive club. A club that finds itself the target of a monsoon of abuse, hate, and general ridicule from every Wikipedia historian, History Channel expert, and everyone's dad. Because members of this club all share in one truth, one knowledge passed from generation to generation, bucked by many, but true nonetheless, that the Russian T-34 is a piece of shit.
I'm about to piss off so many tank boys. I know it.
A bold claim, you might say. And I'd say, well, I can't hear you. This is pre-recorded. But you are right. Such a claim requires, as the French would say, evidence. So I'm going to need my larger glass. Excuse me.
Oh boy.
There we go. Let us begin.
Oh boy.
The T-34 is a tank so steeped in myth and legend, most historians and amateurs can't help but resort to hyperbole when talking about it.
Just when all seemed lost, when the Nazi army seemed unstoppable, this tank emerged and changed the course of World War II.
That there could be large portions of Europe still speaking German if it hadn't been for the T-34.
But why is this? Well,
okay, stop. Already, there's an issue with that. And I knew that issue a long time ago because I used to watch Top 10, and I love Top 10. But, okay. The German army was steamrolling, but the one thing I always took offense to was that the T-34 was technically always fighting. It was always fighting. The only reason the Germans stopped advancing was because, well, number one, winter showed up, and number two, we were starting to open up a second front, which is what Stalin wanted us to do. He was begging the Allies, pleading with us to open up a second front in Italy and hopefully, like, France. Because he knew he couldn't fucking hold out. He had his own issues. Mainly because he had shot most of his good officers because he was a crazy megalomaniac. But yeah, the reason the Germans were really stopped on the Eastern Front was because they had to pull a lot of their troops away from the Eastern Front and move them to places like North Africa, Italy, the coast of France. So yeah, that was already an issue, but yeah. We're not here to talk about tactics, we're here to talk about the T-34. Let's continue on.
Like I said in the Panther Paradox, there are soft factors and hard factors involved in the design of a tank, and many amateur enthusiasts see only the hard factors.
Thanks for that, Pig.
Being speed, armor, and firepower, the trading card thing. With the greater majority of those people believing that to create the perfect tank, one must strike a balance between all three, and many see the T-34 as being that perfect tank.
Perfectly balanced. this whole thing should...
Fuck you,
So
that...
the T-34 sits in a somewhat unique position, okay? The tank was somewhat unknown to Western nations, and after the Second World War, Russia was less than enthusiastic to allow Western historians into its archives.
That's true.
So knowledge from the T-34 came largely from several sources. Firstly, the Germans, who revered it as a groundbreaking tank, vastly superior to anything they have because Russia having better stuff gave them an easy scapegoat to their failures. And being that many were angling for coveted advisory positions in NATO, they were kind of looking up to cover up their mistakes by promoting a number of weird and wacky myths about the Eastern Front, which Russia would ultimately not deny, or be believed by the West if they did, especially once the Iron Curtain had been drawn.
Yep.
This
That's
left
fair.
the famously erroneous memoirs of the German commander to be the #1 source for lazy historians, leading to a lot of assumptions about certain things that, well, just didn't happen. Now, when it comes to the Eastern Front, there's a lot of that going on. I could spend years making videos which dispel a lot about the Eastern Front mythos, and I would still only be about halfway done. So instead, I'll approach each one as it becomes relevant, though I may not be going into the extremes of details, so I apologize in advance if I missed anything out, alright? The second problem was that a large number of T-34s were built after 1945.
Yes.
These post-World War II models were built to a much, much higher standard and are typically the ones you'll find in museums, masquerading as their war-built counterparts. The Hetzer has a similar problem. Now, post-World War II, Russia had a lot of tanks just sitting around that it no longer needed, and a lot of countries surrounding them, which, well, suddenly did. So a lot of documentation produced in regards to the T-34, especially in its performance, in 1946, is actually propaganda. Sales propaganda.
Tank salesman slaps roof of tank. You can crush hundreds of student protesters with this bad boy.
Thankfully,
Ooh, they went right there. Wow, Pig, you went right there? Good on ya.
although those countries would actually receive not the new T-34s being produced, but the older war-built variants that Russia wanted to get rid of, many of which would end up in North Korea and Poland, and several of those would end up in the West, where they could be examined by people like me, and now by you. These T-34s were largely built in factory number 183, that was a tractor factory in the Ural Mountains, which produced around 50% of all Soviet T-34s during the war. We'll get on to why that is relevant in a bit. Now, first things first, because I know a lot of people are going to bring this up. T-34s tested by the Americans. Specifically, the report generated by the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Now, many will dismiss this as a source because the Americans had not been properly trained on the maintenance of a T-34, so they claim. So when the engine collapsed during trials, it was often blamed on the fact that the Americans had not correctly oiled the engine filters, forgetting, of course, that the T-34 supplied to the Americans for testing was one that did not have the later model Cyclone filters. Those were the ones that needed to be oiled. The Americans also had a Soviet engineer who actually wrote the report, who was with them during the trial and was explaining how to properly handle and maintain the tank. This trial has a lot of misconceptions surrounding it, and it's very often disregarded by fans of the T-34 and commie boos alike. We are not going to ignore it.
Good.
And they are going to hate us for it.
Good.
Good for them. You see, the confusion for most is the design of the T-34, outside of some flaws, which we'll get into later, is actually quite good. It's fairly robust, and for the period, a pretty advanced design. However, the plans and production notes of the T-34 are at best hypothetical.
Really?
This is hypothetically the standard to which a T-34 should have been built. But during the war, absolutely no T-34s were built to the standard, and that is where the problem lies. Not in design, but production quality. And this is where you get the arguments. From people who do all their research exclusively online, have seen the plans, the hard factors described in the side column of Wikipedia, the testimonies from Germany's top commanders, and the propaganda issued by the Russians. It becomes very easy to see why this tank is a war winner versus those of us who have actually seen a war production T-34. And I don't mean from behind a rope in a museum. So that argument from either side depends on if you believe we should judge the T-34 based on its actual intended design, or if we should judge it on the T-34 that was actually built in service of the Second World War. Now, funny enough, This argument becomes very easy when we're talking about British tanks. The Crusader is a tank famed for its mechanical reliability issues, which is blamed on its design. It is in fact a relatively good design for a tank, though not really setting any benchmarks.
We just
it did
talked
offer
about
a
this.
solid medium tank, combining good armor and a decent gun with an absolutely ferocious speed. But because of what was going on in Britain at the time, the actual production models which entered service were far below in quality than what they should have been, leading to many mechanical reliability issues that historians will exclusively talk about when glossing over the Africa campaign so they can start talking about more exciting things like Stalingrad. Now, thankfully, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and real estate in Germany became very cheap. And in the 90s, Western historians were allowed into Russian archives for the first time, albeit briefly, up until Putin, where it became illegal to depict the Great Patriotic War in any way that was considered untrue. And who decided what was true and what was not? Putin did. And to a larger extent, the Russian government, meaning if they say,
Oh, does this mean I'm pissing off Putin? Good.
the T-34 is the most amazing tank ever built, then it was. And if you wish to say otherwise, well, I'm sure the Gulag commander will be happy to pass any complaints you have along to the relevant authorities. But during that period of history, we get a lot of insight into the T-34's production and find that the Russians themselves and the Russian government had major concerns about the problematic T-34. But let's talk about that later. I've been talking for a while now and I've yet to actually say anything, so let's
come
dive
on, let's
into
go, let's
the
go,
meat
Pig, come
of
on.
this issue. But first, I need to retcon something. This won't take long, trust me.
The bullshit of 1941.
For the purposes of this video, I am going to be ignoring the year of 1941, and I want to explain why. 1941 sees the introduction of the T-34 in its earliest production variant. The Russians experience fairly high losses, losing about 20,000 tanks in this first year alone, of which 2,300 were 34s, which supposedly the Germans were unable to counter. This fact is often used by Veribus to justify that the 34 was only good in large numbers, as the reason often given for the poor initial performance of the T-34 was that it was only available in small numbers and encountered in small pockets of like 1 or 2 across a wide front. This is of course utter nonsense. Russia had just over 2,000 operational T-34s and would produce another 2,300 of them in the opening months of Barbarossa alone. They were used en masse from day one. You see, a lot of documentaries and stuff like to portray this idea that as the Germans advanced, they beat only these super outdated Russian tanks like the T-26 and the BT series, and it was only later that the more advanced models make an appearance to the shock of the German
They were facing
commanders.
the big shit too.
Ooh. This is not true. They were fighting KVs and T-34s on literally day one of Operation Barbarossa, en masse as well. The high rate of loss number was a multi-factor issue, but largely
Isn't
down
it
to the fact
always?
that the second Operation Barbarossa started, Soviet logistics completely collapsed. Russia was producing more than what it needed in terms of equipment, but the reason you hear tales of Russians wearing boxes on their feet because they had no boots, or the famous enemy at the gates line,
I know, yeah.
One out of 2 gets a rifle. The one without sticks follows him. When the one with a rifle gets killed, the one who is following picks up the rifle and shoots.
it was not because they didn't have enough rifles for everyone, but because they just couldn't get them to the front lines in time. Logistics was second to everything else and would often be dictated down to as an afterthought. Men in tanks had priority, and it seemed to have almost been forgotten that men in tanks also need food, fuel, and ammunition. So early T-34s in the front line, though they were shipped in record time, would typically not be supplied with armor-piercing ammunition, or too little fuel, or no spare parts, meaning that they were quickly abandoned by their crews when they inevitably broke down, ran out of ammo, or ran out of fuel. The Soviets also had a bit of a lack of engineering vehicles like tractors, so when a tank was lost or abandoned, it could not be recovered. That's why that loss number was so high, and why the Germans ended up capturing so many T-34s. By 1942, the Soviets had got their shit sorted out, so this is kind of where we're going to pick things up.
Okay, yep, right there. That was the biggest issue. Logistics. Logistics is the biggest factor military commanders have to put into strategy in order to, like, fully understand things. You need to keep your army fed, maintained, armed, and happy. God, I wish that poor tank crew, the first poor tank crew, to show up at Stalingrad. We are here to fight the Germans. We brought our tank. We're ready to go. We just need ammunition, food, and fuel. Where is it? I'm sorry, comrade. I hate to tell you this, but yeah, you don't have any. What? What do you mean we don't? Well, if the priority was to get you here, was to get you and the tank here, that was the priority. We now have more tanks than the Germans do. But the Germans have food, fuel, and ammunition. Da. But we have more tanks. Who is the brain-dead monkey who came up with this logistics plan? That would be Comrade Stalin. Traitor. I guarantee you, fucking Stalin, yeah. The biggest issue was Stalin was basically micromanaging everything. He wanted to be the supreme military commander who ran everything. It was his famous order that said, like, not one step back. It was his order that basically said, no, you just charge ahead and just numbers will win out the day. Yet they forgot that the Germans were packing the MG-34 and 42. Those kind of weapons make frontal attacks basically as useful as throwing paper at your enemy. Yeah, so around 1942, which is where he's picking up. Yeah, that's about the time some brave general, probably Zhukov. If I know Zhukov, he probably would have been the one to do this. Probably walked into Stalin's office and went, "Look, boss, listen to me. You're running the war well, but why don't you let me take on some of that role? You'll get the credit by giving me command, but of course, you were the tactical genius here. But why don't you let me run the war? I know what I'm doing." That had to have been what happened. Continue on, Pig. Oh, we're starting with the armor. Oh, boy. Oh, boy.
Let's stick with those hard factors first, since they are the easiest for everyone to understand. We are told time and time again that the armor of the T-34 is legendary and pervious to everything because it was sloped. Amazing! What an epiphany the Russians had! Take the armor and tilt it slightly. Ooh! Amazing! Why didn't anyone else think of that?
They did, yeah.
You know what,
there were so many tanks that used sloped armor. We need to have
a discussion. But you know, the people who say this kind of shit always have some sort of mathematical equation which shows angles and relative thickness and effectiveness. And they're like, oh my god, you guys, sloped armor doubles the thickness, guys. And then they always turn to this penetration table, which, look, I don't know. Every one of those I see is different. I'll cover why in a sec. So, armor thickness. Let's talk about it. Probably most of you think that's very important, right? Wrong! You fools! It's not as important as you think it is. The reason these penetration tables are always so inaccurate and typically not regarded with any degree of absolute is because you can do a lot with steel to dramatically improve its toughness without necessarily making it thicker. Sloping is one such example. Another is casting. Casting something from a large single piece as opposed to welding lots of plates together gives you a huge advantage in armor protection without necessarily having to increase thickness and add a shitload of weight. Hence why the Matilda II, with its 60mm of cast armor, was shrugging off rounds from an 88mm like they were made of fucking paper.
Matilda II is the best tank in World of Tanks. Fight me! Whenever I get angry in World of Tanks, I just go for the Matilda. It pisses everybody off. Because, literally, I just drive on at a fucking walking pace because I don't want to spill my fucking tea. I just drive along, just in my Matilda, just in my... Boom! I'm sorry, did I hear something? Boom, boom, boom! Must be mosquitoes. Meanwhile, down the road, there's a guy in a German heavy tank with this big honking gun, and he's about to chew through his own fucking armor. Because why can't I not paint a fucking Matilda? Oh, I love their rage when I'm shrugging off basically everything in a Matilda, and yet everybody else around me is just like pumping shot into me, and they're all ricochet. Ah, Matilda. Whenever I do go to the Bovington, I'm gonna find if they have a Matilda, and I'm gonna give it a big hug. I'm gonna give a Matilda a big hug.
But a Cromwell with 80mm of flat plate armor, typically thicker armor, can't do that. Another way you can do this is heat treating. And this was pretty common.
Heat treating.
Without getting into the real technical aspects of metallurgy, for fuck's sake.
Easy, Pig.
Jesus Christ. Basically, this gives added protection to steel against various forms of shock, like high impacts. Germany, Britain, America, fuck it, everyone
Makes
was
it less
heat
brittle.
treating their metal just to make it that little bit more resilient to anti-tank rounds, and the Russians were no exception. The problem was that while every other country was heat treating up to about 300 Brunel, that's unit of measurement for heat treating, the Russians were heat treating up to 600 Brunel.
What?
Making their steel exceptionally hard. Good thing, right?
Wrong.
No. Heat treating to such a ridiculous amount makes your steel, yes, incredibly strong, but also incredibly brittle, meaning a high impact shot from a round would weaken the tank considerably and often cause it to snap, especially along its weakest points, even if the round did not penetrate, which is why you'll often see pictures of destroyed T-34s with no penetration holes, but these large gaps around the joints, or these weird
That's
why
I get those images. What the hell?
The welding of the T-34 was known to be pretty weak, often just spot welded using inferior materials to make the joint. Had those joints been a little stronger, up to the same standard as the American-made Sherman, it might have fared a bit better. But when you use inferior, badly made steel, poor welds, and thrown together by peasant farmers in a mountain who you threaten to shoot if they don't meet their production quotas, then you end up with a tank that any severe impact will cause it to disassemble itself like a piece of fucking flat-packed IKEA furniture, which is why you see a lot of damaged T-34s with bits missing or mismatched road wheels. Any impurities in the steel, any bad welding, a single solid smack onto the front of the tank will just rip that shit right off.
I did not know that.
It would also explain that in spite of the armor being sloped, which can apparently bounce any shot fired at it,
the T-34's armor is designed to deflect incoming rounds, in particular, deflect incoming rounds that come from straight to the front. So a round is coming towards a T-34, and it hits any of the angled deflecting surfaces on it, then it will ricochet off to the side.
The Russians lose 6.6 thousand T-34s, more than Germany had tanks in total in 1942. When the Germans allegedly don't have anything which can counter it outside of the 88mm. The book Soviet Casualties and Combat Losses in the 20th Century, which was compiled by historians in Moscow using Soviet data, concluded that 54.3% of all T-34s in 1942 had been destroyed by the Panzer III, the so-called inferior tank which could theoretically not penetrate the frontal armor of the T-34 without special ammunition, in spite of it doing it with an almost alarming regularity. But that's not the biggest reason other nations didn't heat treat beyond 300. The biggest reason was armor spalling. You see, when you have steel heat treated to such a ridiculous amount, you do occasionally get the problem that a high force of impact, though not penetrating the tank or even really causing any damage to it, will cause spalling. This is where tiny flakes of steel shoot off in random directions around the inside of the tank, turning the crew into a character from Hellraiser. This was a huge issue in T-34s and was still a problem even in the later
post-war models. Buckshot into an enclosed space.
In East Germany after the wall came down, which were 1946 model T-34s, still had this issue. It is estimated, now this is just an estimate, that the armor spalling counted for nearly half of all T-34 crew fatalities, and why the average chances of survival for a T-34 crew after the tank was hit was about 15%.
15?
It was 80.
Oh, the speed!
Clarkson!
From the offset, the T-34 is designed to be fast. Its predecessor, the BT series, were some of the fastest tanks available at the time of their constructions, and Russia had purchased models of the Christie suspension simply because it allowed for that greater speed, even if the design was a technological dead end, which they were fully aware of. On that point, a lot of documentaries like to state that the Americans rejected the Christie suspension because they somehow saw it as a fool's errand. They were actually very interested in purchasing the Christie suspension, but unfortunately J. Walter Christie was such an asshole that no one in the American government could work with them, and they rejected it on those grounds. Not because, they could see it as pointless. Shut the fuck up, Freedom Booze. You don't get away easily. But
Freedom
like many
Booze?
medium tanks on the Allied side, the 34 is built to be fast.
Holy
and
shit.
built to fire on the move,
for the $2.
allegedly. But does it?
Hold on, I'm sorry to stop this, but fucking somebody here just donated $2. BGC Vetten, caught your life at last. Keep the great reaction. Wow, thank you so much. Oh my God, thank you. Oh my, I'm sorry, but just thank you. I mean, wow. Thanks, I'm touched. Wow. Wow. My life has meaning. Continuing with the T-34. Holy shit.
Why am I asking you this? You don't fucking know, do you? I mean, alright, sorry, I won't be mean. Hypothetically, the T-34's V2 500 horsepower engine, pretty good engine by the way,
That's actually
should
a really
be able
decent
to deliver 25 kilometers per hour, that's 15 miles per hour to my American friends,
Thank you,
on
Pig.
rough ground at about 53 kilometers
Which is
per
pretty
hour,
good.
or 33
Pretty
miles
good for a
per hour
tank at this
on
time.
solid smooth ground. In theory. In reality, the tank's god-awful spur-clash gear transmission, combined with its drag clutch and its 4-speed gearbox, gave the tank a top speed of 15 kilometers per hour, or 9.3 miles per hour, even on smooth roads.
That's slower
This
than
was
the
not because
fucking...
the tank couldn't achieve those speeds, but because transitioning from second to third gear required an extreme amount of force on the part of the driver
that
to
I know.
achieve, while transitioning into fourth required superhuman strength and would more than likely break the gear lever if attempted, hence why T-34 drivers carried hammers.
Yeah.
That is not a myth.
No.
Shut up.
It
The
is
gearbox
not a
problem
myth.
combined with the constant need to shift and change gears in combat meant a heavy load was often
This is
placed
probably
on
why
the
we
weak
switched to automatic transmission. Like, that's why we
such
probably
an
got rid
alarming
of stick shifters. We
regularity
didn't want to
that
be like these
34s would
guys
often carry a
carrying
spare
hammers.
transmission with them into battle in a box on the back. In 1943, a new model T-34 with a 5-speed gearbox was developed, which helped alleviate this problem. However, even by 1955, half of all T-34s produced, even the 85 variant, would still have the 4-speed gearbox. Even then, those that had the 5-speed gearbox could only hit a maximum of 30 kilometers per hour. That's 18 miles per hour cross country. The reported 53 kilometers per hour top speed is purely theoretical, making the T-34 remarkably slow when compared to other Allied tanks.
Oh my
Now,
God.
I have a confession to make. I, LazerPig, used to be a Teaboo. As a recovering
How's your
Teaboo,
empire
even during
doing,
my
pig?
avid defense of the Crusader tank, don't worry, it's not a video I'm going to make anytime soon, I have
We've
to
already
admit
seen it.
that the Christie suspension is not very good. And tanks which were built with it suffered as a result. I mean, for all the benefits of speed it gave you, the cross-country performance was...
Trash.
shit. It was shit. I'm
was shit.
sorry.
It was
The
shit.
stability was awful. The British tried to improve this by introducing a number of additional features, turret stabilization, pivoted guns, huge shock absorbers. The Russians didn't. So while the Crusader enjoyed a fairly high level of accuracy while firing on the move, the T-34
Didn't?
did not.
Oh my
Tests
God.
conducted by the Germans showed it to have the worst stability of any other tank tested, outside of extremely early variants of the
Hey, the
Panzer
Tiger
IV,
Force, they
giving
tested
it
the
the
Tiger Force
capability
against
to
it,
actually hit
and it's
anything
better.
while firing in the move, as being on par
Fight
to
me.
my ability to walk past a bake sale. Fucking love bake sales. Shut the fuck up.
Yeah, they're good.
This was later backed up into individual tests, one performed by the Americans, and then one performed by the Russians, hence why both the T-34M and the T-44, the proposed replacements for the T-34, use a torsion bar suspension instead, something the British would take a bit longer to figure out. Fuck's sake, guys.
天上太阳红呀红彤彤哎，心中的太阳是毛泽东哎。
Like everything else in the T-34, it looks good on paper, but is terrible in reality. Soviet tank guns suffered from low exit velocities and poor ranged accuracy. Though in fairness, this was not due to the gun. This was due to the quality of the powder that they were using in the shells, which is why on paper, this gun can rip through panzers with the sheer raw power of stellanium. But in reality was about as effective as the next few seconds of this child's life against that thing. So, decent gun, shit shells. But while I'm here, we might as well. While the amateur may look at the T-34 and marvel at its gun for being long and therefore obviously superior, the gun had only a marginally higher velocity than the main gun of the Sherman. The later 85mm was comparable to the KWK-40 used on the Stug, though the accuracy of using anything outside of solid-shot AP ammunition was allegedly about 50-50 of it landing where you aimed, which somewhat explains Soviet battle tactics. Several stories would later emerge regarding Soviet tankers' refusal to use the supplied APCR ammunition due to its tendency to explode in the barrel if the gun was not left to cool after being fired, which was rather problematic when you were in a battle and you were trying to fire off as many shots as you could. Now, of course, you can take all of this with a pinch of salt. Penetration tables are typically not accepted as absolutes because they are gained from firing the gun under ideal conditions, with ideal ammunition, at ideal ranges, against solid sheet metal, and as we learned previously, casting, welding, sloping, and heat treating are all ways you could increase armor protection without necessarily increasing the thickness. Yes, big guns shoot through rusty plate like it was paper. Well done! The other problem, which I will...
Yeah, I gotta put this in right now. Yes. That is something I've always had a problem with when it comes to all of these, like, testing ranges that are done. They're always done in, like, the clean conditions. They're always done like, oh, yes, it's right there. We're just going to take a hunk of steel that's untreated, unarmored, stick it in the middle of the desert, and we're going to fire a shot at it. And we're going to put it up completely flat. And that'll and it'll go right through and it'll just be fine. But later on in combat, when that thing's put into action, it's bouncing off like nobody's business. Oh, yeah, it is fucking ridiculous. Oh my god. Those fucking testing tables. I mean, they are just so wrong. They are so wrong. They give it the most ideal conditions. They're like, oh yes, and if it were perfect weather, perfect conditions, we will win every time. However, war is seldom like that. And we get all sorts of horrible conditions. We get weather conditions, the difference. Literally, do you know how many times, like, I could have, hell, just take games, for example. Do you know how many times I've survived getting, like, one shot just by that 1 minute of, I feel the need to turn a bit to the boom. Well, that bounced off me like a brony at a furry convention. Sorry, I had to make that joke once due to a friend of mine. It's a joke. It's a joke. Everybody relax. It's a joke. It's a joke. Yes, Panzer, there are no perfect conditions in battle. There's always different factors. Just because yours is bigger and stronger. There's always somebody who's come up with a better strategy. Like, take me. If there's a big guy in front of me who goes to the gym for 8 hours a day, does steroids, and basically has a roid rage problem, and he's looking down at me, and I'm just sitting here in my pudgy self, and I look up at him, who do you think is gonna win? Simple, me. You know why? Because I got the perfect inclinations just to square him straight in the cojones. Just go up and one swift shot to the reset button and it's over. That battle, he's on his knees, singing soprano. It all comes down to just learning to accept the conditions where it comes and learn to adapt to them. Adapt, innovate, overcome. That should be the fucking motto of battle. Barely, if I may guess, even though you said it as a joke. Okay, everybody, I don't need to go to jail. I don't need to go back to... Shut up, Tribal. Shut up. I just remember that. Shut up. I escaped for good reason, so shut the fuck up. Anyway, continuing on.
I'll admit to is that most statistical sources on the T-34's gun performance do not differentiate between the L-11 and the F-43, and the ones that do are Soviet tank diaries, of which 2 out of the 5 I have read over the years I now know to be fake. At best, what I can say is that the gun of the T-34 is rather overhyped. Not a bad gun, but the people who marvel at it are the same people who call the Sherman's gun a pancake, only suitable for blowing up trucks and armoured cars, and those people aren't really worth bothering about.
The soft factors, okay. Here come the factors that matter.
In video games, it's always the hard factors which typically matter,
Yeah.
so people who take their history knowledge from video games do tend to walk away with a rather obscure
I like
idea
basing
of
Matilda.
what a World War II tank battle actually entailed. I have often stated that tanks which excel in the soft factors, in spite of an underwhelming performance in the hard factors, tended to do better. And I stand by that. Whereby tanks that are good in the hard factors, yet terrible soft factors, do poorly. This was the paradox of the Panther tank, one of the worst tanks Germany ever produced, in spite of also being one of the sexiest. So we can say that the T-34 has terrible armor, god-awful speed, and an average at best gun. But are the soft factors where this tank becomes a war winner? No. No, it doesn't. Buckle your assholes, boys. This is gonna be a bumpy ride.
Oh boy.
Quite literally in terms of the 34.
Yeah, suspension was shit. When did Borat get here?
The 34 has wide tracks, and in having wide tracks, it spreads its surface pressure out along a wider area. This makes it more advantageous at moving through soft ground in comparison to the German tanks, the favourite example being the Panzer IV, whose narrow tracks place the entire weight of the tank into a smaller area, causing it to sink quickly into the mud. Footage then often cut to the Type 4s, which have specially fitted track extensions in order to try and alleviate this problem.
They did have
While
that.
this is true, many have interpreted this as the T-34 never got stuck in mud, whereas in fact it did, quite frequently.
Yeah.
Notable publications on the T-34, as well as its Wikipedia entry, somewhat missed this statement out in regards to the performance of the T-34, but incidents where a 34 got bogged down in the mud were almost as frequent as its German counterparts. The Tiger, for example, had wider tracks than the T-34, and with more road wheels, the Tiger's weight was spread out over 16 points of pressure as opposed to the T-34's 10, which, in spite of being half the weight of the Tiger, actually gave it the same ground pressure per square inch. Ballpark numbers are 1 kilogram per centimeter cubed for both the Tiger and the 76, and 1.02 centimeter cubed for the 85, though people argue about these numbers all the fucking time. Zagula claims the 34 to actually be around 0.85 kilograms per centimeter cubed, and the Tiger to be 1.08, whereas Panzertruppen by Thomas L. Jentz, widely regarded as the best in his field, puts it at 0.74 for the Tiger. Of course, various publications and documentaries will find reasonable excuses as to why the Tiger does not have the same or better cross-country performance as the T-34.
How the fact
Casual
it's a
admittance
heavy
that
tank.
Other factors do contribute to driving through mud effectively, even if the impression given is that the 34 could somehow glide through the mud like it was fucking Jesus. The truth of the matter is rather simple. I'm going to tell you the secret right now, so listen. Tiger has interlocking road wheels. The gaps between them very easily fill up with mud, which, if thick enough or left in the sun to dry out, means that the wheels can very easily jam, giving the impression the Tiger has got stuck in the mud. Once the summer
Hey,
rains
it's a Tiger
began and
Porsche, I
the mud
think.
turned into liquid Russia, the offences of both sides somewhat ground to a halt, though most documentaries write this off as Russia just taking a breather. They're not going to counterattack the Germans and all this heavy mud and ice. They could if they wanted, because the T-34 can just fly across the mud to safety anytime it wants,
Ha!
because apparently...
Put your hands together if you
Easy,
wanna
pig.
clap.
The shit is out of it.
Taste your groove. This monkey rap.
I did mention the 34 was a pretty well-designed tank. Here's where I contradict myself. The wine is kicking in now. Jesus fuck. A lot of people will look at the T-34 as the epitome of the sloped armor design and laugh at the other allied tanks for not knowing that sloped armor makes Nazi shells bounce off your tank like it was gliding through the fucking Matrix. Thing is, the benefits of sloped armor have been known since the 12th century, hence why on some castles you'll find these large stone sloping slabs that helps deflect cannonballs. So for those of you still suckling on your mother's teats thinking the T-34 was the first tank to have sloped armor, here are some pictures of earlier tanks with sloped armor.
French. British. French. French. British. Oh, there's another Russian. Polish. Polish. German. French. Very first.
Ah, for those of you with...
Okay, look at that. There were so many French tanks on that, in that, like, in fact, a lot of people don't like, I know everyone get, like, and as an American, I am also guilty of this, like, the cheese-eating French surrender monkeys. I'm like, Okay. In all honesty, to the French, speaking as a historian, as a real historian, not a memeing American for once, France did stand a pretty good chance against Germany. The problem was... Come closer, come closer. Come closer, my children, come closer. I'm about to tell you the secret, the real reason why France lost. I gotta whisper it in here. Shh, shh. Okay, the reason the French actually lost so quickly is because they forgot to think that, oh yeah, Belgium exists. The problem with the flippin' invasion of France was the reason, like, everything fell apart was because the French looked at their borders and was like, the Germans, they'll only come across the French side, so we'll just build a mesh on a line all the way down our border with Germany. We don't need to go into Belgium. We don't need to put the border across Belgium. Belgium's friendly. They ain't gonna do shit. And what are the Germans going to do? They're going to go through Belgium? No, they'll break international law. They'll break international law. The Germans would never do that. Why are they going through Belgium? Yeah, simple. Giant wall, which only covered the French border with Germany. And the second it hit the Belgian border, stopped. If there is a hole in your defenses, your enemy is going to exploit it. The Germans looked at it and went, well, von Gregley, how are we going to go through this wall? Let's see here. Could we go through the wall? No. They have big guns and very thick concrete, thicker than battleship. Yeah, thicker than battleship. Okay, what's behind the wall? Lots of tanks. Lots of very good tanks with sloped armor, and it's actually very good sloped armor. Oh, very good sloped armor, you say? Yeah. So what do we do? Well, von Gregley, call me crazy. This is crazy, and I'm not a general or anything, but what if we go around? What, you mean through Belgium? Yeah, through Belgium. Well, it's against international law. Who gives a shit about international law? It's only a crime if you lose. Yeah. Okay then. Stop the passes, we're going through Belgium! That is why the French got basically fucking annihilated. Hans von Gregley and Fritz went through Belgium, around the wall. Almost as if a wall is not a very effective form of deterrence or holding things back. So, in terms of French tanks, because I saw the whole thing from Connor here that says I don't like French tanks. French tanks. Where do I start? They look like ducks. A tank should not look like a duck. Just French tanks. They carried more wine bottles than they did shells. They were good tanks. No, Sassy, you ain't late. We still got another 30 minutes to go from this nonsense. We just discussed why Germany beat France. They simply went through Belgium. Alright, onward. Let's continue with the pig.
An IQ above that of a garden salad, you may have asked the question, why didn't the Allies design tanks with sloped armor? You see, the T-34, while being revered as having the sloped armor of the gods, is actually a very good example of both the benefits and flaws of a sloped armor design. The 34's profile is very low compared to other sloped armor designs such as the Sherman and the Panther, both of which are quite tall.
Yes.
As you may suspect, there's a very good reason for this. The T-34 is incredibly cramped. Even on the 85 variant, which is roomier than the standard 76, the crew would be crammed in against each other due to the heavily sloped front and sides, as well as its shorter profile and the Christie suspension, which was robbing the internals of most of its space. And this led to a number of problems. Driving the T-34 is exhaustive work. The ride is bad, being rammed up against everything inside as well as each other. By the time the crew got to battle, they were exhausted. As well as being quite bruised from being bashed around. The lack of room also meant that reloading the gun could be quite the challenge. Though the ammunition storage was surprisingly good, especially for a Russian tank, the average Russian crew under battle conditions could fire maybe 1 to 2 rounds per minute. Germans could fire 4 to 5. It also meant that supplies inside the tank were rather limited, so they would typically be stowed on the outside of the tank, which would often catch fire when hit or simply be destroyed during a battle. This meant that T-34 units would have to wait on supply convoys catching up with them, giving them less autonomy in comparison with the German units, who could carry sleeping rolls, food, water, as well as digging tools, spare parts inside the tank with them. There was an attempt to alleviate this problem by providing armoured storage units, which were these large boxes on the back, and you'll see a lot of them on models of the T-34 from 1942 onwards. The final problem, of course, was crew mortality rates. I mean, getting hit by a penetrating shot would, on average, lead to the deaths of about 85% of the crew, and also meant that bailing from a tank that was on fire was almost an impossibility. These numbers...
85% mortality rate. Okay, so T-34 usually has a crew of around, I'm gonna say, if I remember, let's see. We'll say an average of 4, maybe 5 guys. 80%, 85%. That means at least three of the guys are gone, dead, finished, finito, in the holes. At least one guy is getting out with probably missing a leg, or maybe badly burned, or blind, or mortally wounded and will soon die, and one guy making it out. Fucking A. Jesus. Wow. This is ridiculous. Hello, Luna.
Were calculated based on averages obtained from experience of the T-34 in Korea. Now, the Koreans, being on average shorter and smaller framed than the Russians, still found the tank incredibly cramped. There is one more problem with the T-34's design that I will touch on. Outside of the terrible gearbox, the transmission units, the fact the hull gun didn't use smokeless cartridges, and the total lack of internal space.
It didn't use smokeless cartridges. Oh my god, how did they breathe?
Move around, and that was the fuel tanks. Unlike every other tank in the world, these were kept in the fighting compartment.
You kept the... You put the fucking fuel thing. No, now I'm starting to guess why I haven't been able to find good pictures of the interior of the T-34. Putin, you hiding shit from me? Oh my god. Fucking A. The T-34 is a bigger dumpster fire than an actual dumpster fire. Oh my god, fuel tanks inside? Oh, 85% pig. I think you misplaced that 8 with a 9. You should have put a 9 in place of that 8. God, if those fuel tanks went up, they would have been cooked.
With the crew. This is why you see so many pictures of the T-34 burnt out with their turrets missing, having apparently exploded. This is also another reason why crew mortality rates were so high. And yes, since I can picture you furiously masturbating into the comments, diesel does catch fire.
Yeah.
Shut up.
Okay, misconception on diesel. Diesel is less likely to catch fire by accident. Doesn't mean it does less likely does not mean immune from fire. It's a little bit more resistant, but that doesn't mean it won't catch fire. Yeesh. The hell? Oh, now we talk about the manufacturing.
There are a number of issues which many haters of the T-34 will attribute to design, but I feel it more fair to place under the category of manufacturing defects. I'm waving my hands around for the drama, but I'm forgetting you can't see me, which is a good thing, believe me. Now, information we found in the 90s is going to come in handy here. As I said, the T-34 design has its flaws, but is ultimately not bad, especially in comparison to a lot of other tanks around at the time. Two-man turrets were pretty common, British tanks also used the Christie suspension, and the driver of the early cruiser models couldn't escape unless the turret was at its zero position. German tanks were not stabilised to be able to fire on the move, and the French tanks were pathetically slow and fuel-hungry. And of course there's Italian tanks, and we all know about them. All tanks have their serious flaws, unless it's the Matilda II, which was glorious and had absolutely no faults whatsoever. Shut up, don't fact check that, trust me. Shut up!
Shut up.
However, none of the above-mentioned tanks have a failure rate that can match the T-34, both in terms of just how often it would break down or be destroyed in battle. Why is this? The Germans would like you to believe that it's because the Russians were deployed in huge waves, that they sent hundreds upon hundreds of troops against the Germans until they just simply ran out of ammo. This is not true. The Russians would like you to believe that their huge losses on the Eastern Front was because the fighting was so intense, so brutal, so powerful and generally epic, and absolutely nothing to do with their consistent tactical failures and poor chain of supply. No, of course not. Listen to how epic the suck is and shut up! T-34s.
I just have to say this just this once. I want to see more movies about the Winter War. I'm wearing a Finnish cap for a reason, fellas. Just remember. Let's start talking about Finland more. Pig, if you ever do see my videos, which I will always wonder why you would ever come here, because I'm nothing. I'm a nobody. But let's talk about Finland sometime, please. Finland needs to be talked about.
Were built badly. There's really no other way to describe it. To give you one example, many people will ask why early British tanks were bolted and riveted and not welded. Well, this is because Britain did not have a lot of welders. Britain was a train-based economy when trains were riveted and bolted together, so most of the welders were stolen by the Navy and the Air Force, who had priority. So when the tankers, who had to scrounge around for what was ever left, had to look around to see what they could do, all they found was all these factories building trains, which were obviously full of riveters and stuff, and they would go up to them and say, hey, could you build a tank?
Blackadder goes forward.
What's a tank? Does it look like a train? I could probably build a tank. And I go, yes, it does look like yes, just build a tank that looks like a train. That's perfectly fine. Just build a tank that's same way you build a train. That's perfectly fine. All right, lads, let's get gun on top of train. Come on, the British are coming. Woo-hoo! Now that would be a fucking documentary worth making. Jesus Christ. What was I saying?
I want to
so
see
the men
that
and women moved into
documentary.
the factories. No, the men went to war, the women moved into the factories, and they needed to be trained how to weld. But we also need 1,000 new tanks for Christmas, so it's kind of just easier to bolt them together. Meanwhile, new welders are being trained up. So early Crusaders riveted, new Crusaders welded. Yeah. Russia, however, just gave the new guy a welder and told him to get on with it. Hence the rather poor quality of the welds.
Let's stay on topic.
But there are other factors as well, okay? So each Russian factory produced T-34s to slightly different specifications. Factory 183 produced some of the worst T-34s of the war, and were largely responsible for all the examples we're about to go over. But they did produce 50% of all T-34s made. That's an impressive 26,000 tanks. More tanks than most nations had in total during the war. How the fuck did they do that? Well, gigantification is a factor. Factory 183 was fucking huge and could therefore produce way more tanks than smaller factories. However, there's another more obvious factor. In 1941, it took 8,000 man-hours to build one complete T-34. Factory 183, by 1943, had gotten this down to 3,700 hours. How? Well, they made shortcuts.
Oh, of course
Firstly,
they
found things to just remove from the design. Lights. Tanks don't need those. Now crews can't see in the dark and would hang lanterns on their tanks and often get confused, leading to one incident where a group of T-34s followed some German tanks around thinking they were following their friends. The seals around the hatches. A lot of time can be saved with just not bothering with those. During rain, even light rain, the hatches would leak, causing water to drip over the electronics inside and short them out. This often meant that the turret motor would seize and have to be manually cranked, which was not easy given the lack of room inside. The hatches would also rattle loudly in their frames, deafening the crew and making it harder for the commander to give instructions. Internal radios, who needs those? In fact, only the command tank would have the radio, which was just for receiving commands from HQ. This meant that the coordination of T-34 squads was incredibly poor, and often the firepower of a large group of T-34s would be wasted, as they would be unable to coordinate their fire and all shoot at the same target. It was also noted a lot by German commanders when they were spotted by a single T-34, that tank would stop and fire, while the other T-34s in their group would just carry on obliviously. Chairs. Yes, some T-34s lacked internal seating, mostly for the hull gunner who would just find a box or something. Heat treating. Do we really need to heat treat all the metal? I mean, not all of it is going to be under fire, so the internal components, like the gearbox, the drive shaft, etc., were not heat treated and prone to excessive grinding, which wore them down faster. Turret basket. You know that platform the gunner and the loader stand on so they're always lined up with where the gun is pointing? Don't need that. They can just turn around like real men and learn to duck so they don't get smacked in the head by that breech every time the turret moves. Lack of rubber? Don't need it. The T-34 has steel road wheels on steel tracks, both often not heat treated and would grind against each other, probably another factor in that tank's surprisingly slow speed. But it would also mean that during the drier and hotter seasons, turning the tank was a bit of a risk, as the unheat treated pins had a tendency to rub along the wheels and pop out, meaning the track would just fall off. You know what? I'm out of time and there's a lot of these and I can't be arsed, so here's just a list.
Megalomania, really?
The general reliability of the tank is something often frequently marveled at. Rugged is typically the word used, and often the great drive from Kharkiv to Moscow, which was done to demonstrate the reliability of the T-34, is brought up as evidence that the tank was capable of long marches without breakdown, ultimately forgetting that the tank actually broke down 3 times, and the designer who was driving the tank at the time was so exhausted he caught pneumonia during the trip and fucking died. It's also forgotten, and I said I would ignore 1941, but this is important. The 8th Mechanized Corps, on its 500-kilometer march in June of 1941 in good weather, lost half of its tanks due to mechanical breakdowns by the time they'd arrived. And this was actually a fairly common occurrence, and even by 1944, the famous tank riders would be writing about their frustrations regarding how often the T-34 would break down and they'd be forced to catch up on foot. Although you would struggle to find a historical documentary which mentions this, I can guarantee almost all of them will talk about a similar situation with the Panther tank with a modest glee. This is again the double standards of the lazy historian. Mechanical breakdowns of the Panther are the absolute pinnacle in discussing why this tank was a failure, but the mechanical failures of the T-34, barely a footnote worth mentioning. In 1942, an order directly from Stalin was issued to the troops. It reads as follows.
Cringe.
Our armored forces and units frequently suffer greater losses through mechanical breakdowns than they do in battle. For example, at Stalingrad front, in 6 days, 12 of our tank brigades lost 326 tanks out of 400. Out of those, 260 was all to mechanical problems. Many of tanks were abandoned on battlefield. Similar incidents can be observed on other fronts. Since such a high incidence of mechanical defects is implausible, the Supreme Headquarters sees it as covert sabotage and wrecking by certain elements in tank crews who try to exploit small mechanical troubles to avoid battle. Henceforth, every tank leaving battlefield for alleged mechanical reasons is to be gone over by technicians, and if sabotage is suspected, the crews are to be put in tank punishment companies, or degraded to infantry and put in infantry punishment companies. Here, the suggestion, if you weren't listening to my perfect Stalin impression, was that the breakdowns were occurring due to crew sabotage. The soldiers who didn't want to fight purposely sabotaging their vehicles. There are no records if or not the mentioned technicians did find any sabotaged vehicles, but what is recorded are the numerous complaints from front commanders about the T-34's horrific unreliability. Major General Coton, who had designed the infamous KV tank, held a conference in September of 1942 at the Ural Tank Factory. That was Factory 183, by the way. Upon testing all the tanks under construction, he found that only 7% of them did not have any defects. And while he was ready
Only
to admit the
7%.
numerous flaws in the tank's design, emphasis was again placed on factory workers purposely being lazy or deliberately negligent. Cotton, however, did admit it was impossible for a T-34 to drive more than 50 kilometers without breaking down. But he would also admit something else.
What? The sights?
I'll include the sights here because here's the thing. There are some T-34s which have excellent gunner sights, and there are many that don't. People keep arguing over if or not the sights of the T-34 were any good, and many proclaim that the gunner sights were the best of the war. What I found is the gunner sights were actually pretty good. All the other sights, however, like the wide view for the gunner, the commander, and even the periscope for the driver, were shit. The Germans, using captured T-34s, claim it impossible to see out of the tank unless the hatches were open. Later versions used cupolas copied from the German tank designs, but these had narrower slits and offered a very limited view. Periscopes provided to the rest of the crew if Factory 183 ever bothered to put them on, rather than being made of mirror and glass, were in fact made of highly polished metal, and were typically quite blurry. There were also several stories where quickly rushed T-34s were produced with no polish whatsoever, making the periscopes unusable, and when they were used, the scopes were unheated and badly sealed, meaning they had a tendency to fog up or fill with moisture and freeze, making them basically unusable. This would be backed up by numerous German claims that the T-34 could be fired upon without the crew being aware that they were under attack, and would often drive into ditches and trenches, unable to see what was right in front of them. In one famous example, the crew of a 37mm PaK-36, known as the Door Knocker because of how ineffective it supposedly is, fired upon a T-34 27 times before it finally noticed them, moved to run the gun over, and missed. Now, this is not because the Russians did not know how to build good sights. They did. In fact, through Lend-Lease, they had access to a number of British and later American tanks, all who had excellent sights.
Yeah.
And there are some models of Russian tanks.
Oh yeah, that's right. Lend-Lease. They had Shermans. They had everything because their T-34s were apparently, from the look of it, were trash. Christ, I could make so many. I could make so many things, but I don't want a Russian drone over my head.
That have sights that surpass even those, but for whatever reason, they're just not implemented en masse. Now, this might be a production issue, it might be a supply issue, it might just be Factory 183 doing its thing again. I don't know. If you know, let me know.
Quantity over quality.
Also known as the endless wave argument, the disposable tank argument, your dad's argument, or more likely the sentence you've had in the forefront of your mind since this video began, that the Russians built the T-34 in the way it did because it had to. The enemy was at the gates, and the endless supply of T-34s, a tank still superior to its German counterparts, was necessary to beat back the furious might of the Third Reich. Because hey, the Russians won, my dude. This is the quantity versus quality argument, and people using this argument will tap their nose, look at you in that smug way, and say something stupid like, quantity has a quality of its own. Let me put it like this. Would you rather have 100 cheap tanks or 50 expensive ones?
50 expensive.
Because 100 tanks is not just 100 tanks. That's twice the crew, twice the training, twice the fuel, twice the supply trucks following it around, twice the spare parts, meaning those 100 cheap tanks can end up costing you a lot more than you would have thought. You also have the problem that cheaply made tanks with poorly trained crews are going to suffer a higher rate of loss, meaning you're constantly going to need more tanks and more men to fill the gaps. The more experienced ones have a higher chance of surviving, creating experienced veteran crews who are likely going to perform better overall, hence why Russian tank aces are quite rare. Quantity has a quality of its own, sounds good on paper, and is believed by those kinds of people who view war as a series of battles, with numerical superiority as the ultimate advantage. It is an argument that makes sense if you believe that the German tanks were superior in every aspect, where the Russian tactics were to simply scream "Hoorah!" and charge until the Germans ran out of ammo. However, as we know, the German tanks were not superior, nor did the Russians use human wave tactics. In battles where quantity has met quality, and that includes World War II, quality has won every single time.
Look at the Shermans.
On the Eastern Front, the Russians had, on average, twice the number of tanks the Germans did, slightly higher if we include Lend-Lease, but would lose over 3 times the amount of tanks Germany did. But the Russians still won, my guy. The Allies.
The
Though it
Allies!
has in recent years become a thing that the Russians proclaim they won the entire war by themselves, much like the Americans, the idea that any of the major Allied players could have won the war by themselves is at very best a fantasy. Russian Eagle stats are taken on the basis that they killed more Germans than every other front combined, and therefore did most of the work. But this only takes statistics from the war that actually happened. If the war in the West never happened, if Britain and America never got involved, if we take away the high-intensity bombing of German factories, the resistance movements that were funded and supplied to by the Allies, the secret bidding war that denied supplies of valuable tungsten and aluminium and titanium to the Germans, forcing them to make lower-grade designs without it, the huge amounts of Lend-Lease equipment and supplies offered to the Russians through the war, the supply raiding, the oil denying, the deterioration of the Luftwaffe, the massive distraction America provided for the Japanese. Could Russia have actually won the war by themselves?
No.
No. Russian armoured losses stood at nearly 100,000 vehicles, of which 45,000 were T-34s, leaving them with just 12,000 surviving tanks by 1945. German tank losses in the east stood at 40,000, and this includes tanks that were lost and handed over after the war ended. In order to destroy every tank Russia ever had or produced, the Germans would have been required to maintain an average kill-death ratio of 2 to 4. They achieved a 3 to 5. With all the troops freed up from the Western Front and the various policing duties around Europe, as well as assistance from Japan and all the materials it needed to produce better designs, it was very likely Russia would have just run out of tanks. In spite of their huge production output, they could not offset their losses had the Germans just been able to hit them with a little more intensity. The 34 was trapped in a cycle of production. Cotton could have demanded better craftsmanship all he wanted, but Factory 183, 112 and the majority of others were ordered to produce as many tanks as physically possible. And that's exactly what they did. Russia needed more tanks to make up for their losses, and this in turn forced them to crank out tanks of a poor quality, many of which were lost in huge numbers due to that poor quality, which in turn required more of them to be built. A never-ending cycle, which many proclaim was entirely unnecessary, and Russia just made a better tank, or at the very least made them to a higher quality, as even by 1944 it had become common practice to replace the engines of any T-34 that had been running for more than 30 hours before a major assault.
Jeez.
But hey, my guy, at least the T-34 was cheap, and it could be manufactured in high quantities. I mean, there are stories about the T-34 just driving straight out of the factory and onto the front lines. Really? You got a source for that? Because I've heard that story too.
Yeah,
but I've
me
never
too.
seen it verified anywhere. And considering how most Russian tank factories were moved east, far away from wherever the front lines would actually extend
behind
to,
the Ural
I have my
Mountains.
doubts that that's actually true. Hi, it's post-production LazerPig here. So I looked into this a little further and found this. While there's no evidence that it actually happened, there are 3 instances where this story could have come from. The first is Odessa, which is a battle that is enshrined in myths due to the sheer importance of it in Soviet history. The factory here, amazingly, without any heavy equipment, up-armored tractors using Navy steel and improvised weapons to create the knee tank. Because the battle was in the city, these were quite literally driven from the factory to the front lines. Opinions are divided on how effective this tank actually was. The second is Kharkov. The Germans captured part of the tank factory there, which includes around 50 pristine T-34s. They then put this factory to work repairing the T-34s that they have in service, as well as producing them in a limited number. The third is Stalingrad. There was a tank factory there which produced T-34s. The city had no power, and with no supply, its ability to actually produce any T-34s would have been dubious at best. The ammunition was also produced in a different factory, so any tanks within the factory would have not been combat ready, but, given the intensity of the fighting at Stalingrad and how bitter the Soviet defense of the city was, it's not really a stretch to presume that all the tanks within the factory would have been utilized, complete or not, giving the impression they'd been driven from the factory to the front lines. Anyway, just thought I'd clear that up for you.
Interesting.
You see, most documentaries and historians, when they're talking about the T-34, will take the line that its mass manufacturing offsets its failings. It sort of allows them to end on a more neutral point, which is fine if you want your Russian visa to not suddenly expire, but given my sexual orientation prevents me from ever getting one in the first place, I don't have that problem.
And
So
fact
here's
is,
the
I don't
truth.
want to go to Russia anytime
T-34
soon,
was
so I'm
not
good.
designed to be cheap and mass-produced. It was actually a fairly expensive design. American studies on the T-34 suggest that if built to American standards, the T-34-76 would cost around the same amount of money, resources, and manpower as the Sherman, even when accounting for the Russian economy of the period. The Sherman, which had better stability, better suspension, better armor, more crew comfort, could carry more equipment and ammunition, was considerably more reliable, less maintenance heavy, and had an 85% crew survival rate, albeit with a marginally inferior gun. The T-34 was not a cheap tank mass-produced in infinite waves. It was a costly tank manufactured cheaply, with its numerous teething issues never getting the chance to be fully ironed out, with Russia's only choice but to continue producing more at extremes of poor quality in order to offset the tank's staggering losses. Had the T-34 belonged to any other nation, it would have been regarded as an abysmal, embarrassing failure of a machine. But as a Russian tank, it became a thing of legend, its history carefully curated by a country which, up until 2012, still had a government propaganda department dedicated to it.
What?
The tanks of other nations may have lacked the slope armor and the T-34's sexy looks, but they all ultimately proved to be vastly superior fighting machines. You can sit there and you can tell me all you want about quantity over quality and how you'd rather have 1,000 T-34s over 100 Tigers, but the reality is, for 100 times the tanks, you need 100 times the supply. And in a war economy with a failing infrastructure, that's not always feasible. And the one thing you cannot manufacture cheaply in a factory is human lives. If or not, Russia would have suffered far less losses simply by producing a better tank or a 34 to a higher standard is a debate that will be raging for years to come, and one I'd rather just not put my nose in. There's just not enough alcohol in the world. Soviet designs would follow on from the T-34 philosophy, with the later Cold War tanks all following the same mantra: cheaply built and cramped. While these designs look good on paper, with many Western publications and self-proclaimed military analysts looking at the Soviet designs as rugged, reliable, and battle-hardened, it was the Western designs that were winning the wars, even in situations where they were hopelessly outnumbered against alleged superior opponents, which ultimately explains why the Russians haven't produced a good tank since 1965. Fight me. Anyway, I'm out of wine and my throat hurts. It's time for LazerPig to go back to sleep. Good night, and have a very Merry Christmas. Or a Happy New Year. Or a Happy Easter, depending when I actually get this fucking video out. But before that, I'd like to say a big thank you to Alexander Mealy for giving me some money for coffee and reminding me that I actually have that set up to take donations. You don't have to donate.
Oh my god,
fine.
I forgot. Even I have a coffee.
But seriously,
Holy
thank
shit.
you.
I
And
forgot
to
all
you,
about
Alex, this one's for you.
Are you ready, kids?
Aye, aye, Captain.
No.
I can't hear
Is there anything
you.
left? Anything left? No, 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 no. No, 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 no. We are not bringing SpongeBob into this channel. Fuck that. Holy shit, I have 20 people watching me. Thank you all for showing up for this. Oh my god. So, yeah. Yeah, the T-34. What a trash heap. Yeah, 50 tanks. Give me Shermans, because, god damn it, the Shermans have outlasted all of them. Think about this. Think about this for the Sherman tank. This is a tank that was said to be like an inferior. Will I react to the A-10 next? Well, since that little bit like bitching at the A-10 happens to be one of my favorites. I want to see what this pig has to say about my fucking one of my fucking favorites. So yeah, maybe. But as for the Sherman, look at this thing. The Sherman was built to be basically just a tank we could produce off the factory like it was nobody's business. And it was still superior. And not only that, we made so many that we were selling them to more countries than I think the T-34. And not only that, when, I was just about to get there, Panzer. The fucking Israelis were still using Shermans in the 1960s. And not only that, the Shermans used by the Israelis were upgunned from the 75mm to the 105mm. A similar gun to the one we still use today. And they were knocking the teeth out of T-55s and T-62s. God. To the Sherman. The greatest tank ever built. Made by America. Now, after that dumpster fire and the fact that I've been at this for an hour now, it is time for me to disappear. So thank you all for watching, and thank you again to BGC Vitan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Thank you for the $2. Or BGN. I'm gonna have to We're gonna have to figure out what that means. But thank you again. Thank you for making me feel like I'm actually worth something here on YouTube. It really means a lot. But before we go, make sure you like and subscribe, turn on notifications, follow me on all my social media. Of course, if you want to support the channel, by all means follow me on Patreon. There are rewards coming soon as I can get them all finally figured out and finished up and finalized and here. I can start doing shit like that. But thank you all so much, and as always, you know who I am, I know who you are. And as LazerPig said, the T-34 is a piece of shit. Bye!